The skeletal system of the human body is an amazing network of bones, and that network is very important to our overall functioning. So as we begin to look at the skeletal system, first off, this skeletal system is going to be divided into two different parts. We recognize the axial skeleton and then also the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the bones that form the longitudinal axis of the body. This is going to be primarily the trunk and the head of the human body. And then we have the appendicular skeleton, which is going to be the limbs, and then also the girdles that are appended to that trunk, which is the axial skeleton. So in addition to just bones, the skeletal system is not just bones. It does also include our joints, cartilage, and then also some ligaments. The bones that we do have, they perform a long list of actual body functions. We do think of them as supportive structures, but it's much more than just support. So if we take a look at the different functions, support is number one, top of the list, and this is because the bones are going to form the internal framework that supports the body, and not only does it support the body and help us to remain upright, but it also provides a cradle for a lot of the soft organs that we do have inside of our body. In addition to this, there's also a protective role involved. Protection of soft body organs. If you just think about the cranium, that is going to contain the brain, and so it's definitely protecting that. We have a lot of other soft body organs that are on the inside of our body, and we have things like the ribs, the pelvis. Those regions are also protecting those organs from damage. Movement is very important. The skeletal structure, the bones, they provide anchorage points for the muscles to attach to. So the muscles, they will be providing movement for the body, but they have to work in conjunction with the skeleton. The muscles are going to use the bones as levers, really, to move the body and its various parts. Storage is another one. Storage may not be one that kind of immediately comes to mind, but it does. In the bones, we have a location for storing different adipose tissue, and we also have mineral storage that's going to take place in the bones. Lastly, we are going to have blood cell formation as a function of the skeleton. And this is specifically what we're going to call hematopoiesis. So the bones will be the site of that. As far as the human skeleton goes and just how extensive it happens to be, there are actually 206 different bones that make up our skeleton. The bones are of two types. We have compact bone, and then we also have spongy bone. And if you look at the picture right here, you can really see visually right off what the difference is between them. The compact bone is the portion on the bottom. Compact bone is very dense. It has a smooth, homogeneous appearance to it. And then the spongy bone looks spongy. It's small needle-like pieces of bone. There's lots of open space within that, and you have a pretty decent sized layer that you can see in this particular image. So if we talk about how we classify our bones, the bones, first off, they can be classified just according to their overall shape. There are 4 different shapes that we do recognize, and the first one is a long bone. Long bones are your typical bone shape structure. These are made up primarily of compact bone. And then if you look at the picture there, I said they're primarily your kind of normal, typical bone shape that we think of. So they're real thin down the middle, so that's the shaft of the bone. And then they've got these larger regions on the 2 ends, and we call those the heads. This, where we're going to find these would be in the bones of the limbs, so arms and legs, and then also in the wrist and then the ankles as well. Another shape that we have are the flat bones. Flat bones are going to have 2 layers of compact bone, and those are going to be sandwiched over top of a layer of spongy bone. These are going to be thin, flattened. A lot of times they are curved a little bit. A good example of these are the ribs that we see right here. This does also include the skull and then the sternum, which is going to be right here in the center, and that's the bone that we see in the particular image. The short bones are going to be mostly spongy bone. These are going to be bones that we do find in the wrist and the ankles. And then the last one that we have, they don't really fit into the other categories. So because of that, we do call them irregular bones. They have a very odd shape to them. And this is going to include the bones of the vertebrae. We've got one example of it right here. You can see how it has a very unusual shape to it. So it doesn't really fit into the other 3 categories that we've distinguished. If we look at bone structure, the bone that we see right here is an example of a long bone. So again, it has that classic bone shape that we think of. We've got that long slender area in the middle. That's the shaft, would be the common name for it. And then you've got these two heads or larger regions on the two ends. More official terminology is that the shaft is going to be called the diaphysis. Well, this is most of the bone's length, and this is mostly compact bone that we will be looking at there. The diaphysis is going to be covered by the periosteum. The periosteum is fibrous connective tissue that forms a membrane, and this is going to be connected to the underlying bone by connecting fibers, which we call perforating fibers or Sharpie's fibers. The endosteum, this is a delicate connective tissue lining that we would find just inside of the periosteum. And then if we look at the ends of the bones are called epiphysis. We have a proximal one, and then we also have a distal one. So we do distinguish those two different ones, and these are going to be made up of thin, compact bone, which is then going to be surrounding the spongy bone. And you can really see that in the image here, that in that head, in the epiphysis, you do have a lot of spongy bone, and then over the top of it, you've got that compact bone. Within the epiphysis, we have what's called articular cartilage. This is going to cover it. It is covered by glassy hyaline cartilage, so that's kind of a bluish colored cartilage, and it's very slippery. It's going to decrease the friction at the joints, so that would be the primary reason for it, or its primary function that it is going to play. We also have this distinctive line that runs right along the epiphysis, and this line is really a remnant of bone growth, as our bones were still growing when we were younger. In an adult, though, it's just a line. We call it the epiphyseal line. This is a remnant of the epiphyseal plate, and this would have been kind of growing in both directions to give us an increase in the size, the length of the bone. But again, as we mature, this is going to stop growing, and we just see the remnant line. If we take a closer look at the bone structure and just magnify some of these different areas, the portion that you see on the bottom here that's been magnified is a cross-section of the diaphysis. One area that we haven't really talked about yet is the yellow bone marrow. So that's what we see in yellow right down the center. This is primarily a storage area, and that is a storage area for adipose tissue. Besides that, this is also where we see that hematopoiesis. That is the formation of red blood cells, and that's going to occur in infants. When we look at the bones, we can also see specific markings on them that reveal the location of different structures. So we can see the locations of muscles, tendons, ligaments, and we can also see where blood vessels and nerves have passed through. Additionally, we have projections and depressions. These are two different areas that are notable on bones. Projections, or also what we call processes, these are things that project or stick out, grow out from the bone surface. And then your depressions, which we also call cavities, these are going to be sunken in or indentations that we can note. Long list of these, and this table right here is really just showing us a few of them so that you can get an idea of what we're actually talking about. So just take a quick look at those just to give you an overview of, in this case, projections, what kind of shapes they happen to take on. If we look more closely at the bone structure, down the center of this particular bone, we have spongy bone. And then around the outside of that, we have compact bone. But besides just the bone part of it, we also see the red, yellow, blue lines extending throughout here. And these are really communication networks, they are nerves, they're also blood vessels. If we talk first about the communication network is what we call perforating canals or Volkmann canals. This is going to run from the outside of the bone to the interior of the bone, and again, it's used for communication. If we take a close-up look at the bone so we can see it in more detail, besides having these tunnels that your different canals and your nerves, your blood vessels are going to run through, we have a lot of osteocytes surrounding that. The osteocytes is just a fancy word for the mature bone cells. So the mature bone cells are going to be there, definitely, and these are surrounding these canals or these tunnels that are going to carry the blood vessels and the nerves. These canals are what we call central canals or haversian canals. Bone formation, growth, and then remodeling is something that's going to change throughout our lifetime. Our skeleton is made up of both bone and cartilage, and then the proportion of the bone and cartilage really depends on our developmental stage. Here we can see three different pictures of the skeleton, one in an embryo, one in a fetus, and then one in a child. And one thing that I want you to really notice about these pictures is that we have a much greater proportion of cartilage when we're an embryo, and then as we develop from an embryo into a fetus and then ultimately into a child and later an adult, our skeleton is going to have much more bone than cartilage in it. So again, notice we start out mostly as cartilage with just a tiny bit of bone, and then the progression is to have much more bone with just a little bit of cartilage on there. If we look at the process of bone formation, this process is called ossification. Ossification starts with a hyaline cartilage model, and that model is completely covered with bone matrix. The bone matrix cells are called osteoblasts. So osteoblasts are bone-forming cells, and what's going to happen is that we have a temporary stage where the bones are made of cartilage, and that is enclosed by bone. And then over time, the enclosed cartilage is digested away. This is going to open up a medullary cavity within that newly formed bone. If we look at bone growth, our bone growth and then also the bone remodeling is in response to several different things happening. If we look at the bone growth side, this is going to result in an increase in the length of the bone. This occurs because we have cartilage that's being produced, and you can see where the cartilage is being produced in this image. We have basically that happening in step number 1 and then also in the place designated number 3. And then there's also going to be locations where the cartilage is being replaced by bone. So that's number 2, and then that's also number 4. So the production of the cartilage and then the replacing of the cartilage with bone is going to increase the overall length of the bone. The bone remodeling is something that takes place in conjunction with that, and bone remodeling also takes place throughout our entire life, really. In this case, we are changing kind of the overall proportions that we do have in the bone, or in other words, we're changing the diameter of the bone as the bone is extending in length. So you can see here that the epiphysis, the head of the bone, is getting a little bit wider, so that's the red dotted line. It's kind of growing it out this way. And then we also have where the shaft is being thinned in a little bit. So you, again, can see that with the red dotted line. Bone remodeling is something that occurs in response to 2 factors. The first of those is calcium levels in the blood. When our calcium levels drop, so when they become low, the parathyroid gland is going to be stimulated to produce a specific hormone. That hormone is parathyroid hormone. We call it PTH for short. And so that is going to be produced and it's going to be released into the blood when those calcium levels are low. When that happens, that will activate osteocytes, so bone-forming cells, to break down the bone matrix, and then they're also going to be releasing calcium ions themselves. And as they release the calcium ions, they are increasing the calcium levels back up. When the levels get back up, so when the levels are seen to be high, then calcium is going to be deposited in the bone matrix as calcium salts. So that's the effect of the calcium levels. Another thing that affects bone remodeling is going to be the pull on the skeleton. And this is the pull of gravity and also the pull of muscles. Osteoblasts, they are going to lay down new matrix and become trapped at regions where bulky muscles happen to be attached. The trapped osteoblasts are then going to become osteocytes. So if we just kind of sum up what we're saying here, basically PTH, that hormone, is going to determine when and if bone is to be broken down and formed. And then the gravity and the muscles, the stresses that we have on the actual skeleton, these determine where. So location where the bone matrix is to be broken down and formed. So when and where are obviously both important when we're talking about bone remodeling. If we look at errors in this process, one example, kind of a common example of a problem with the skeletal system is rickets. Rickets is a disease in which the bones fail to calcify, And typically this is due to a lack of calcium, and we've talked about how important calcium is in regulating bone remodeling, or it can be due to a deficit of vitamin D. And vitamin D is important for detecting calcium levels. So the two of those can cause the bones to not calcify properly, and that causes the bones to not be quite so sturdy. And you can see here in this image, this would be an x-ray of someone that has rickets, that then you end up with bones that have a curved structure to them because they can't handle all of those stresses that they are subjected to. Throughout our life, our skeleton is subject to bone fractures. So we can have bone fractures. And how susceptible we are oftentimes has to do with our actual age. As we are young, our bones tend to be stronger, and then as we age, those bones become thinner and weaker. If we're a child, if we're talking about youth and we're talking about bone fractures, typically those happen because of what we call exceptional trauma. So a specific accident, twisting, smashes to the bone, and so they can cause a fracture. As we get older, it's still going to be some type of event or activity, stress that occurs to our bones that causes the fracture. But again, the susceptibility is much greater because we have thinner, weakened bones. So what might not have actually fractured the bone as we were a child, it may actually fracture our bone as an adult. Here we have a look at just some of the different ways that bone fractures can be classified. They're classified kind of according to what the actual stress did to the bone, whether it broke the bone into many pieces, fragmented it, whether it crushed the bone, whether it kind of snapped the bone. And then we have different terms that refer to those different types of occurrences. Here we're looking at the different stages that are involved in fracture repair. Since our bones are composed of living cells, they can repair themselves when fractures do happen. There's 4 different stages that occur. The first stage is a hematoma is going to form. You can see that here as the red coloration. So that's happening right through the center between the bones around that particular fractured area. The second stage is the formation of the fibrocartilage callus. That callus you can see there shown in light blue. By stage 3, we have bony callus that is formed. And then by stage 4, there is the remodeling process that takes place so that that fractured area does actually get healed.